Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, The Decay of Lying by Oscar Wilde. In this video we're going to be looking at what is artistic realism. Now, artistic or aesthetic realism can refer to a number of different positions in the philosophy of art. In some situations, often called pictorial realism, it refers to the question of how a picture or a painting can represent an object despite being distinct from that object. The object is an apple made out of fruit. The painting is a piece of canvas made out of canvas and paint. How are those things the same? Check out our video on the problem of pictorial representation for more. In other situations, realism describes a trend in a particular field of art whereby the art takes on a more realistic quality, and there have been various waves of realism in various artistic fields over time. Further, it might simply describe that feature of a piece of art that makes it accurately represent reality. For example, a picture that is very realistic. But in this video, we're going to focus on the artistic realism that Oscar Wilde is reacting to in his Decay of Lying, namely the normative claim that art should represent reality, something also called naturalism, particularly in reference to the works of Émile Zola. But generally, aesthetic realism is what we're talking about. This intuition that art should be realistic or mimetic of the real world goes back to Aristotle. In fact, Aristotle distinguishes what we would call art today from craft or other skills in his Poetics by defining this kind of art in terms of imitation. Theater, painting, etc. are all inherently mimetic arts. Their purpose is to mimic reality, according to Aristotle, not to serve some other purpose like a craft such as building a house or weaving a basket might. For Aristotle, realism is one purpose of art, because that is what it sets art apart from other crafts. Though Aristotle also puts forward some more functionalist rules for art, particularly tragedy, that we're going to see in a future video. Or you can just check out our series on Aristotle's Poetics if you want to learn about it now. Now, someone may be an artistic realist in terms of style or subject matter, though most advocated both. The subject matter is the content of the art, the thing being represented. Are you representing something that actually exists in the real world, or something that's fantastical or imaginary? In terms of style, the question is, how are you portraying the thing, not what are you portraying? Do you do so by attempting to mimic reality as closely as possible, or by using more abstract methods? A photorealistic drawing of a dragon may be realistic in its style, because it's very realistically drawn, but not in its subject matter, because dragons don't exist. While Picasso's cubist painting of a bowl of fruit is realistic in its subject matter, he's replicating something that is actually out there in the real world, but not its style. It isn't attempting to create something that makes you think this is as identical to what is out there in the world as possible. The same lines may be drawn in literature, film, and theater. Many pieces of musical theater, such as Fiddler on the Roof, have a largely realistic subject matter, but present it in a non-realistic style, characters breaking into song, etc. In contrast, films based on fantasy novels, such as Harry Potter, often use a realistic or naturalistic style. The ways characters speak to each other and act are generally an accurate depiction of reality, or a very naturalistic depiction of reality. But they have very clearly non-realistic subject matter. They're running around casting spells and waving wands. Works such as Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream are not realistic either in style or content. They're people that are speaking in very performative language directly to an audience, which people generally don't do on their own, but also we have fairies and love potions and magic going on. While works like Ibsen's A Doll's House take both a realistic style and a realistic subject matter. Within each of these distinctions, we might further divide realist from non-realist tendencies. In terms of the style of a book, we might say that the narration is very realistic, but the dialogue is overly melodramatic and not realistic, which could be a purposeful choice by the author to separate out the dialogue and the way that these characters speak as something that's not correspondent to reality, but to have the narration be something that is very realistic in a different way. A performance might feature realistic speech with non-realistic movements and blocking of the actors moving in abstract patterns around the stage while speaking in a very normal conversational way. In terms of content, a story might portray nothing fantastical or imaginary, but still not be realistic in its narrative. For example, all the plot threads get neatly wrapped up, there's an uncomplicated victory by the protagonist, etc. In fact, many stories seem to do this, that are otherwise somewhat realistic. A story might have a clear build-up, climax, and resolution in a way that reality seldom does, making its narrative unrealistic, even if its subject matter is otherwise realistic. Now, there are a range of cases to be made for realism or naturalism. Some stem from the idea that truth is paramount, and that art should be used as a way of elucidating or expressing truth. In this way, art should do its best to faithfully represent reality, because truth is the goal of art, and art is simply representing reality to others. Others argue that nature is in some ways perfect, and art should do its best to imitate and replicate that perfection in nature, or maybe not perfection, but good or moral positiveness, something out there that is virtuous in nature, and art should do its best to replicate that. Still, others argue that the goal of art is to get the audience to become so enthralled as to forget they're consuming a piece of art, and thus this goal is most effectively achieved through a realistic representation of the subject matter. Now, realists argue that the purpose of art should be to accurately depict real life. This has the advantage of providing a clear metric on which to judge the quality of art. The more accurate it is, the better the art. This ideology was supported by the illogical positivist project of a full scientific explanation and quantification of the features of the world. If there's a need to have some objective scientific analysis for words like beauty and art to have meaning, the quality of mimicry seems like a strong candidate for defining the purpose of art. If we need to have some way we can score out whether something is beautiful or whether something is good art, it seems like how well that thing corresponds to reality is something that we could put into numbers in a way that art for art's sake or art for some social goal can't as easily be judged in empirical terms. Another justification of realism can be found in Plato's distaste for art in general, particularly the poets. Plato argued that reality was a poor mimicry of the pure forms, and therefore art, a representation of a representation, was even a step further removed from the truth of the pure forms. For Plato, we should focus on studying those true forms, not their poor representations in reality or their even worse representations in art. Using such a hierarchy, the best kind of art, then, would be that which most faithfully represents reality, as it loses the least in its mimicry. Now, there are a range of objections to the realist viewpoint, often coming from the other two views that we're going to highlight in this series. Oscar Wilde's aestheticism, that advocated for art's sake, and aesthetic functionalism, which argued that art should serve some societal purpose, perhaps reinforcing morals, giving psychological happiness, critiquing systems, etc. Now, one might object to realism, arguing that the goal of art is often escapism. The real reason that you want to look at a piece of art after a long day of dealing with the painful minutiae of life is not to see that same monotony reflected back to you. Rather, it's to provide you with an escape from your day-to-day life, to show you the world as it could be, as better than it is. You don't need a world that gives you that same minutiae you deal with every day, day in and day out, that has that same pain, that same suffering, that same lack of beauty and lack of perfection. The point of art is to let you imagine the possibilities and expand your mind to something beyond what you have in your day-to-day life. This is in line with both Wilde's view in The Decay of Lying, that nature is in many ways imperfect, and art's goal is not to imitate those imperfections in nature, but rather to show nature how it could be perfect. But it's also in line with a functionalist view of art as a way to achieve pleasure, because many people, after a long day, do not want to see more of the same painful reality that they experience day in and day out. Another objection from the functionalist perspective is that the role of art is not to portray life as it is, but rather to influence people to change their behavior or beliefs. The goal of art is to provide a moral foundation for society. If art is realistic, then it reinforces those existing moral harms. If I see the wicked often succeed and the virtuous fail, As is too often the case in the real world, I may think that I should be wicked to succeed. For some functionalists, there is a moral responsibility of art to not represent the world as it is because there is such harm or moral bad in the world, but to rather represent it how it should be to reinforce the morality of the population, or lead the population to perhaps question moral structures and to challenge those existing norms. There are other reasons you might be concerned with realism. You might think there's not one single point of art, and it's merely a matter of preference if you prefer realistic or escapist art. So there's no sense in which any of these three positions are right, since there's no right way to do art to begin with. Conversely, you might argue that realists are wrong because it's impossible to actually realistically depict life, and that the mere fact that something is an artistic representation means that it can't be realistic, so the entire project is doomed from the start. Now, music is one realm that is a particularly challenging objection and issue for the realist, as there's not a clear correspondence of music to reality. Few compositions actually resemble the songs of birds or other natural sources of music. Music is in many ways purely artistic. What then makes music, particularly solely instrumental music, beautiful if it can't correspond to reality? While this is a problem for the realist conception of art, it is a central feature of the aestheticist conception. As we'll see in the next video, it's exactly this lack of correspondence with reality that led the aestheticists to claim music was the form of art that other arts should strive for. What do you think? Should art represent reality, or should art be more imaginative or moral than reality is? Do you enjoy art that's stylistically realistic, that has realistic subject matter? Both? Neither? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Subscribe if you like this video and you want to see more. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any others. Support us on Patreon if you have the ability. And stay skeptical, everybody.